good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you all to the next book discussion in the series IHC Conversations with Authors that is presented by Habitat Library and Resource Center. On behalf of India Habitat Center, we extend a warm welcome to the author for this evening, Dr. Gautam Bhan, whose book Cities Rethought, A New Urban Disposition is being featured in today's discussion. We welcome Dr. Mukta Naik, Lead, Policy, Center for Sustainable Urban Livelihoods, National Institute of Urban Affairs, who will be in conversation with Dr. Gautam Bhan. Dr. Gautam Bhan is Associate Dean, School of Human Development at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Bangalore. At IIHS, he teaches, researches, and writes on the politics of urban poverty and inequality, urban and planning theory, housing and identity, and social practice. Dr. Bhan also leads work on urban welfare regimes, social protection, and informal work. His new projects include work on child health outcomes for the children of informal workers in domestic work and construction, as well as the advocacy work on urban social protection regimes. He holds a PhD in city and regional planning from University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Bhan is widely published. Most recently, he is the author of the book In the Public's Interest, Eviction, Citizenship, and Inequality in the Contemporary Delhi. And he is also co-editor of the book Routledge Companion to the Planning in the Global South. Dr. Mukta Naik is a policy researcher and practitioner, a writer and an urbanist with a body of work in housing, urban informality, internal migration, and urban transformations. Dr. Naik has a background in architecture and urban planning. She has worked across organizations in the development and think tank world. She is widely published in academic and popular publications and has taught in design, policy, and planning at several reputed universities, including TISS, SPA, and Ambedkar University, Delhi. She is currently lead policy at the Center for Sustainable Urban Livelihoods at NIUA. May I now request Dr. Gautam Bhan and Dr. Mukta Naik to please take forward discussion on this book. And I request all of you to please keep your mobiles on silent mode. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those generous introductions, and thank you everyone for being here today. And it's an absolute pleasure to be able to be in this position to quiz Gautam, maybe grill him a bit. When I was reading the book, I was thinking of how you wear many hats. Your scholarship has been focused on urban informality, law, policy. As a teacher, you've helped a lot of young professionals shape their ideas about cities. And then these also intersect with your engagement with grassroots organizations. So I see all these personas in Cities Rethought. So I thought maybe you could start off by giving us a bit of an overview of the key concepts before I grill you.
Sure. You've used the word grill 3 times now.
Yes. It's just to put a little fear.
It was not on the poster, Mukta, when we started off. No, it's such a pleasure to be here. And my thanks particularly to IHC and Bhavna as well. We were meant to do this last month, and I got this new viral that seems to never leave your soul that we get nowadays. And such a pleasure to be here with you, Mukta. So I'll be very brief about the book itself, because I think it'll be happy to chat more in answer to Mukta's questions. So the first thing is to say I will talk about this book through the we, because it is a collectively written book. There are 4 names on the cover, and we all 4 actually wrote it together. So there are not sections that I wrote or a chapter that belongs to one. It's on an edited volume. It is a collective text that mattered to us a lot, because one of the things that we tried to say about the sensibility of knowledge is that the best knowledge comes collectively. And so, but as academics, we are not quite trained to work collectively. In fact, in many of the knowledge systems, in the Indian academy, we do much better. But in the academy I was trained in, we were punished for collective work. Co-authored publications would not count towards your academic tenure files. Like if we were told, iske saath kyun likh raha hai? Like you have to, it was all about notions of excellence that were about individual genius. The brilliance, it's a very particular way to relate to knowledge, and particularly to politics. And it also matters who the 4 of us are. So just briefly, I want to tell you about my co-authors. Edgar Pieterse is a South African academic and policymaker who was an anti-apartheid activist and now was the founder of a place called the African Center for Cities, a sister institution of IHS. It's really important that it's not the Center for African Cities, but the African Center for Cities, which is about an ethic of producing knowledge from the South and not just to be case studies in global theory that is produced from New York or London or Tokyo. Though nowadays I have to say they've had their moments. So it's Singapore, Shanghai, and Dubai, where theory comes from, and the great cities list has shifted. Sue Parnell was one of the youngest women coming out of South Africa to be part of the International Science Congress, and she was a planner, again one of the founder members of the ACC, now a professor at Bristol. Michael Keith heads anthropology at Oxford, but for a long time used to work on China, and then left the academy, stood for election, and became Labour MP from East London, where Brick Lane is. And so actually his Bangla is more fluent than many people that I know. And he knows that Sylheti Bangla and Dhakai Bangla and Kolkata Bangla are not the same thing, which is a lot for a Labour MP from Oxford. And so for all of us, this sense, I think we were looking for a text that made sense of the different parts of our lives. We were trying to connect what we learned as activists from what we learned as teachers, from what we learned as policymakers, and what we learned as academics. And fundamentally to also think a little bit about the fact that in each of those roles, while we did not feel that knowledge was not essential to what we did, when we went as academics, people asked us about knowledge. When we went as activists, no one asked us about knowledge. It's as if we stopped thinking about a certain kind of criticality, right? But we also realized that our relationship to knowledge was different. So there was a lovely piece by a South African academic called Philip Harrison, who again used to be an academic teacher of planning and then became the head planner of the city of Johannesburg. Now, he wrote a piece in a journal which simply said what I read when I was chief planner of Johannesburg. That was the whole piece. It was his reading list. What did he read when he was taken out of the classroom and put in a quote-unquote practice position, right? What was the relationship to knowledge? And a surprising argument he made is that while he thought he would want to read very policy memo, tell me what to do, empirical rich fact studies, he said all I wanted to read was abstract critical philosophy. Because I knew the what to do story. I was faced with countless trade-offs that felt moral, not just technical, and I had nothing to guide me through those choices. So I kept returning to first principles. I kept returning to a different relationship to knowledge. I wanted creativity. I wanted to read about artists. I didn't want to read planners telling me the exact specification of the width of a street zone which could make a complete street where a street vendor could be next to it. He said it's important. But I know how to make a cycle zone. What I don't know is how to think about streets in a holistic way that can change people's minds about how they should be built and used and occupied, right? So we kept coming back to this point of saying we actually don't want to write a particular book about a particular subject. We want to write a book about knowledge and about a sensibility and about a way of thinking about cities and a way of thinking about cities that could speak to all the roles we had led. And the second thing I'll say quite quickly is that when we started to write it, we felt like we were writing at a particular time. And this became clear to us as we were going on. And what we meant by this is, we were all trained. We're quite, let's just say we're not the same age, but we were trained very much in the same tradition, which meant that we had a certain language that we just took for granted. Modernity, globalization, urban, democracy, international law, human rights. We were, and in the time we were writing, all of those categories felt like they were slipping away from us, that they just didn't hold meaning in the same way. I mean, what is international law after Gaza? What is it? What is this liberal democracy order when you can have the Prime Minister of Hungary saying, actually, liberal democracy is overrated, right? In the heart of Europe. So what happens now after, and to also know that a lot of those words, we had only critiqued as never being our words in the first place. They were never written by us or for us or here. So we felt stuck in a moment where the language we had felt insufficient. And the categories we had felt insufficient, not just because of the climate question, not just because of the complexity of this form. I mean, look at where we are now. We live in an urban region of 27 million people that has no precedent in human history. I don't know if an urban agglomeration the size of Delhi NCR is meant to survive. I hesitate to recommend it as an urbanist. I don't know what it is meant to be. We have no precedent. The only other region like this is Tokyo, Yokohama, but it has 150 times our per capita income. But we don't know how to look to Dhaka, Kolkata, which is close, or to Lagos, which may have better lessons, right? So it also felt like we were looking in the wrong places and using the wrong words. And so ironically, it felt the only way to think about the city was to, for a second, stop thinking about the city, was to step away from our ways of knowing and not be so certain. So we didn't use the words then, but now when we talk about it, in a way it feels, I don't know if some of you have read Gramsci writing about the interregnum. Right? So Gramsci is this famous political philosopher in Italy, writes in the 1920s, just before World War I. He can sense fascism is coming. He can sense the rise of the fascist parties, right? But he can't put his finger on it. He's like, something is changing. He's writing from prison. And he's right, something is changing. And he writes about it as a time, and he uses this word. He says it is an interregnum. It is a time in between. And there is this lovely quote where he says, the old is dying, but the new is not yet born. And I felt like this was us in this book. The old is dying and the new is not yet born. And there is unfortunately a second line to the quote that very few people cite, which is, the second line is, it is the time of monsters. There are morbid symptoms, things we do not explain. And if you realize now and you look around, I feel like a lot of us keep saying, but why would anyone do this? How can this be happening? Simple example. How can Gaza just happen? How can white working class voters vote for Trump? How can we explain A, B? The list for India is so long. But this feeling, right, that things happen that don't make sense, it's the time of monsters. So this return to a sensibility was this for us. And it was saying, okay, so step back. And very simply, we said one thing, that for too long for us, the acts of thinking and the acts we're doing were too separate from each other. So we thought without doing and we did without thinking. And that both of those had let go of feeling. So really the book is about thinking, doing, and feeling. How do you think about what to do? How do you think about what is to be done? Why do you do the things you do? And because we are still academics, even though it's collective, we couldn't just say thinking, doing, and feeling. So we said the normative, the analytical, and the operational, which is just thinking, doing, and feeling in different ways. And so that's what the book is. The book is not, it doesn't tell you what to think, but it pushes you to say you have to think, you have to articulate a position. It doesn't tell you how to interpret things, but it says if you only look at things in one way, in one discipline, in one note, it won't work. And then it says, in the end of the day, to ask yourself, what would it mean to translate this knowledge into the doing of things? And in doing so, it's trying to avoid this old trap of practitioners telling theorists they have nothing to offer and theorists telling practitioners they have no thought, both of which are just foolish positions to take. So how do you put together thinking, doing, and feeling? How do you put together the why, the what, and the how? That's the sensibility. That's why it's called a disposition and not an ideology or a position or a framework. It is about a way to be in the world and about a way to do it. And that's the book we wrote.
Thank you, Gautam. Actually, I was also thinking when I was reading that, that you've used the city as a metaphor for complexity. And so much of, what we read, we think about complex problems and wicked problems. I mean, in the policy world, especially. But then you are 4 urban scholars who came together to write the book, and you're writing it sort of as if you're philosophers of knowledge production and mobilization. Was this something you were aware of as you were writing it, or was this some sort of a life it took of its own accord? I was just curious about that before I get to more urban kind of questions.
No, it took that life of its own accord because the interregnum is real, because we just didn't have the certainty to say, do this in the city today. This is what the contemporary city needs. I mean, there are many books called The City. And we were just unable to wield that certainty because it felt false. And so actually we were like, this is a moment where we have to step back and think about the way we rebuild a certain sense of language, knowledge, and certainty. So the edge of it really is about taking that interregnum seriously. We found ourselves stepping back and saying, it is not the time to hold your ground too firmly. It is actually the time to rethink about how to build towards very, very reconfigured presence.
And just on that note of process, how is it that the four of you actually worked through this? I just can't get that out of my head. There are four people sitting in four different places who have four completely different bodies of work, and you've somehow written in one voice, and that's not an easy feat. So I'm really going with the broader questions first, because I think we're a diverse audience here, and these things always are difficult to pull off. So what was the actual process of doing this?
So I will say I was very well trained for this because I anchored the writing of the Parcha of the Delhi Queer Pride for its first 7 years. And if you have ever been the editorial in charge of a collectively written parcha of any movement space in India, God, you get trained in negotiation and collective writing. You get trained to validate everyone's thought while knowing that you cannot put every thought on paper. Right? So I found myself drawing from a very odd set of experience, saying, I've done this before. No, I think we were two things for us. One, I think, is we have known each other for a while and think of each other as what is a term we use in the book called a community of practice. And I think it's very important that we are not a community of friends. We are not friends in the personal sense. We are a community of practice which has a very similar set of ways of looking at the world, but that are also radically different from each other, right? And I think that it now I look back on it and I realize it helped that we weren't friends. Because when you write collectively with friends, everyone knows where everyone's buttons are. So in friendship, you know how to press the right button when you want your way. I didn't know what their buttons were. And they didn't know mine. And I think this saved us in some ways. I think the other thing is that we have, and what it meant for us is we were also very lucky because we were working on a large project together. So we had chances to keep meeting. And the other thing we realized that if we did not spend time actually physically writing together, this would not happen. So it took us much longer than we thought, but it took us the time to act. If we sat in a room and wrote things and passed them around each other, wrote into each other's writing, we collectively, we had a very frank talk about, and some of us were more sensitive about being edited than others. I'll leave it at that. But I think there was a lot of ego checking at the door. It was actually extraordinarily humbling. But I would say, I think what got us through is we were so excited about each other's thought that it felt stupid to let your ego get in the way, because what you were getting was so much more. So honestly, it was not nearly as hard as people think, because the excitement of what the collective process brought was unbelievably good. I mean, there is a story here about lychee trees in China that only Michael can tell, right? There is a story about Sue feeling like a 22-year-old woman in a science congress that only Sue can tell. The joy of those stories was very, very, very powerful, I think, in some ways. Now, would we be able to do it if we had a very particular argument to make? I don't know. So the fact that we were writing about a disposition, which was itself open, I think allowed it. So sometimes I think forms of collective writing also need to match forms of argument that can be open enough to not need a lot of agreement all the time. But a lot of it, honestly, is a kind of community of practice that has been built over years with a very deep, not respect, a very deep excitement about each other's way of thinking. I think that's what held us together.
No, I think, these values of collaborative work or collective work. And the other thing, what I got out of what you said was just curiosity. I mean, so much of our world is consumed by putting ourselves forward and our work forward and hustling, as they say, that the space for genuine curiosity for the work of your peers is also very small. So to reopen those spaces also is sort of an important step forward in this moment.
And I was told after the book that it's been a while since you wrote something of your own, with that very like auntie at a farmhouse party vibe. And I was like, yes, it has, and so it's amazing, it's like a little thing like this, like the fact that sort of you can, like a system can feel a little annoyed that 4 people wrote a book that is actually unconcerned with certain kinds of positioning. It's amazing how much it irritates like a certain kind of academic. It's quite fun.
Yes, destabilizing the order every now and then.
I don't know that, but okay.
So to get into the weeds of the book, I was really intrigued by this notion of analytical redescription. And the reason for that is because in the space of practice, there's already such a reliance on good practices and case studies and this sort of building on past experiences to think about what you want to do in the future. Of course, it's more linear and objective than what you describe it, but this is established practice, already. But in this book, what you seem to be saying is that we need to we need to do the work to ask the right questions, which is more important than actually finding the path forward, and pick and frame our puzzles carefully. What prevents us from doing this in our practice? Why do we tend to respond to pre-framed questions and shy away from this redescribing? What's that trap that we are stuck in?
Let me give a very quick example of what in the book we mean by redescription. Right? The idea is, so the term we use is a puzzle, and we describe it often as a knot. Right? And if you think of a knot, literally that the knot you get in the nada of your pajama, that knot. Right? The trick about a knot is you can see it, you can see what's overlapping with what, but you can't see it clearly enough to know how it became knotted in the first place. And the problem also is that if you pull the right nada, it will open. But if you put the wrong one, it will tighten further. Right? And dikhne se pata nahi chalta. So to me, analytically, redescription is very similar. You need to look at the knot. And you need to look and take the time to say which is the nada that is overlapping in which one. And I think 2 things happen. And a quick example of that we use in the book. So we give example of 5 puzzles in the book, just stories. The one I had offered in this was actually a story about all the migrant workers who left our cities during COVID on the highways. Right? And very simply, you had thousands of workers on the highway violating one of the world's harshest lockdowns, risking death, risking police force. The chief minister was standing and saying, don't go. I will give you food. I will give you vaccination. No one will go hungry, and was actually genuinely trying his damnedest to do ration, to do delivery. It was not a fake promise. You could genuinely sense it. And every time newspaper, media, folks started reaching the workers on the highway, they kept saying, "Aap kyun kar rahe ho yo? This is foolish. 300 kilometer Chhattisgarh chal ke ja rahe ho. You are walking on highways." And they were all, and when the Stranded Workers Action Network got there and asked them, "Tell us why you're leaving," what was the thing you would imagine? Health, 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 COVID, COVID, COVID se bhagna hai, COVID se bhagna hai. Bhook lagegi, naukri chali jayegi, salary nahi hogi, nothing. Rent. The 41% of them said rent. We can manage hunger, we can manage salary, we can manage everything. We can't manage rent, right? This to me is the thing of what is the problem you are trying to solve. How have you shaped, with all good intention, the chief minister was like, "I'm feeding you, vaccinating you, I don't understand." But it was rent. And then the interesting part is, when the word got back that it was rent, what did the first thing the government did? Announce a rent moratorium. Now, the problem with the rent moratorium in a city like Delhi, how do you implement a rent moratorium? When you don't know who is renting, where the landlord is also informal, the tenant is also informal, there is no contract, who is going to enforce a rent moratorium? Now, here to me is a fascinating story of redescription, doing and thinking. So even when you have the right will, you have a rent moratorium that in this city you cannot implement, because 88% of rent in India is unwritten oral agreement. And that is the most generous figure I can think about it. How do you find it, right? Which is a practice problem. But the first problem was saying we were answering the wrong question. So redescription for us is to say, and I think 2 things happen. Why don't we do this more often? Why don't we stop and say, why are they going, instead of deciding? 2 things. One is the imperative urgency to act. The thing about living in perpetual crisis is that it creates a notion that you don't have time to think. And the more time I spend in practice space is very weird to me. I understand that practitioners sometimes feel that academics and theorists take forever as if there is endless time. But the counter is just as dangerous. An endless construction of immediacy and urgency basically convinces you that you cannot afford to stop and think, and you keep forgetting that you cannot afford to not stop and think. Now, of course, that thinking has to be different. We don't have time to do large-scale studies and generate evidence, but you cannot let go of thinking. So, and I have seen this set of urgency, this narrative of urgency, sometimes when it is genuine, and other times when it is absolutely created. An absolute, you are in practitioner spaces where the appearance of urgency has a logic of its own. And so there is a kind of sense of saying, you've got to move this like this, right? And so this thought that you can do things with consideration, there is a certain way we have configured professional practice to valorize speed and agency at the cost of uncertainty. The second thing is, in practice, it has become very difficult to admit that you are unsure. So best practice, model, silver bullet, win-win solution. No one has ever said, I don't know if we should do this, right? So what has happened then is that you also create in practice a situation where the option to, a lot of our students are architects, and we always ask them, here's a spatial problem, right? Kanchan will know this, fix this. You know the one thing very few architects say? We should do nothing. They refuse to consider an absence of intervention as a practice. They refuse to think that sometimes it is the best to leave it alone. Because as a practitioner, you are trained to solve a problem. So analytically, you struggle to frame the problem right, but the other is the ethic, the orientation, the disposition around solving, as opposed to being present as part of an engagement. This has shifted in the language of practice, and we train younger practitioners to have exactly this sensibility. Go solve the problem, right? Go find the win-win solution. What is a win-win solution in a complex system, you tell? It is intellectually indefensible. Even if you have a win-win solution, you can have it for a moment, and then the system will change. That is the nature of systems. So we've lost the ability to go slower. But again, I want to emphasize, urgency is not fictitious. There are places where thought needs to move faster, and there are people on the theory side of the divide who are not agile enough as they should be. But the fight is on both sides. And the last thing I think that's happened is a hyper-specialization of disciplinary education, an utter narrowing on what it means to be taught as a professional. Incredibly narrow skill sets, incredibly narrow differentiations. I'm not even talking about an overemphasis of the technical over, say, the political or the social. That we have struggled with in Indian higher education for a long time. I'm saying within a kind of deep skill specification as a differentiator that has lost the ability to see the bigger picture in those questions. So I think the disciplinary narrowing of our training has really been an issue. And I think that I just stick to the example of architecture, not because architects are uniquely at fault, it's just where I went. I usually do this to economists, but why not architects today? One is this, the other thing here is, you ask an architect, what materials are you trained on? You are trained on how to build in concrete and how to build in steel. You look around and say, what material are the houses of most urban Indians built on? Tarpaulin, bamboo, asbestos, tin, and mud. That is the reality of it, whether you like it or not. When you fly into Bombay, the thing you see is blue. No architect is trained to work with that blue tarpaulin. How is it that the material you are trained on is not the material your city's housing is built in? It's a fundamental disjunct, right? So this is a fundamental disjunct. And now, with sustainable material and sustainable architecture, we have returned to bamboo as future modernity, right? And to me, it's amazing that it took climate change to get us to bamboo. Right? Now, again, this is not a hit on architecture. This is true of all our disciplines. It is a narrowness. I used to really rage against the Eurocentricity of our teaching. But honestly, in a lot of Indian academy, we have fought that battle for a long time. Our social sciences fought it very early. My generation was born in that fight. Out of that, we never had to inherit some of the worst of it. But our technical education has just not done the work that our humanities and social sciences have done. Our engineering, our architecture, our planning, our urban planning education is completely has no notion of our cities and literally comes from a paradigm that has nothing to do with our urban life. So I think that to me, it is also producing a set of practitioners who are unable to deviate from the thing they know. And then we get caught again in asking and solving the wrong problems.
So that sort of leads me to the question of the pulse, as you call it, right? So, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that there is one is an issue of data, absence of data, or selection of biased selection of data, or invisibility of visibility of some data over uh, prioritizing data in different ways, and so on and so forth, or prioritizing information. But then you talk about the importance of pulse, and you talk about it as a political pulse, or but also this question of choosing or framing the problem in the right way, choosing the right puzzle, or in the not choosing the right strand. That's also coming from pulse. So going back to your COVID example, and I remember we having this conversation that we knew it was rent before anybody did any survey, because we work in the field and we worked on that question for a long time, but nobody was asking us, right? We were jumping up and down, and that's not how knowledge and how conversation works in a crisis, because you're either relying on data which is biased and which is selective, or you're relying on the spot surveys.
Or now the problem is
there's too much data, so it's giving you a confusing picture.
And it doesn't tell you where to look.
So what is this pulse? And how do we... pulse is an inexact thing, right? And we're all comfortable and not very comfortable with these inexact things. So how does the book really bring in this pulse, and how does it apply to what we do here?
So it was really funny. So the pulse comes in the church chapter of the book, which is about operations. So it's about practice, right? And it's the when question. It's like, how come you say the same thing for 15 years and for the first 14, no one gave a shit? And suddenly in the 15th year, everyone's listening. Like what? How come sudden ideas get this vogueness, right? That they emerge. Like folks who started talking about cash transfers as social protection, for example, did this for decades. And then suddenly in the 90s, you have this moment. Then it goes away. Then it comes back. And we were thinking, all of us, around these moments, right? And we didn't only want to think, because there's this thing that everyone says, a crisis is also an opportunity. We were like, but that's not what it is. It's not always a crisis. It's also put that there is a... So I kept thinking of something that an elder activist had said to me when I was very young in an anti-war protest opposite Zakir Hussain College. And she kept saying, you have to understand how to... What is the exact what she said? She said, Hawa ko chakna sikho. You have to learn how to taste the air. Right? It was this idea that you have to read the politics of a moment. And I kept saying this in our meeting, that you have to taste the air, right? And you translate it and just does. I don't know, everyone looking at me and they're like, what do you mean you have to taste the air? I was like, like this, you have to be like, what's the feel? Like what? And I remember Michael was like, it's like a pulse. There's a pulse of the moment. And actually we settled it trying to translate this. You have to feel the air, right? There are two ways to do it. One is that as a practitioner, you have to realize that certain ideas find a political moment, and you will never really know why. But your job as a practitioner is to recognize it and put your foot in the door, because that's that moment. I'll give you an example right now in Delhi. We are back to a moment we were in 2009, 2010 before the Commonwealth Games, because as we speak, 15 different bastis are being demolished. Demolition scales that we have not seen for 20 years, right? And so pulses are not positive. The same pulse came around the Commonwealth Games. Kuch nahi keh sakte tu. You could not, because the games had this logic, they had a pulse, right? Now in Johannesburg, the FIFA World Cup allowed the BRT, bus rapid transit system, to sneak in. That's also a pulse. In ours, it did the opposite. It took our BRT away. Literally, it was so striking. But the games created this moment. I don't know what to call it. It's not too short to be a conjuncture, too long to be a moment, but a certain period where a certain political idea becomes very powerful. And suddenly, if you're able to mobilize it, it becomes. So to recognize that pulse, right? And the examples we use is cash transfers as ideas suddenly, but also negative. Demolitions are there is a pulse right now where you are unable to say anything about that bulldozer, right? Every tactic you have tried is, and we have been here before. And everyone's favorite example is to say, Turkman Gate ke time pe 75 mein Delhi mein bastiyan giri thi. But there were many cycles like 75 was. It was not 75. It was also 2006 when the industries were moved out, in 96 in that judgment. It was also 2008 before the Commonwealth came. So we've had these cycles and they are pulses. Something changes in our democratic framework where it suddenly becomes possible to bring a bulldozer media ke samne and no sarkar falls and no Taj falls and no newspaper headline screams at all. But a demolition can happen. So recognizing these pulses, surviving. So it was about a sense of practice saying part of our work is not to have the right thing to say or do. It's also to know when to be able to say the right thing, where to say it, how to create a kind of moment that every activist knows intuitively. वो ज़हन में पता चलता है, तो ये अभी नहीं चलेगा. You can hear it in the demolition discussions on the groups today. We know कि अभी court के सामने, if we go with a certain rights argument, we will not get a second. So we try different types of angles. So I think a pulse is almost like it's a way to contextualize knowledge in the social political circumstance of a time. And it is naive to think that knowledge by itself is sufficient, which is why I have never understood this word evidence-based policy making. As if all policy making was waiting for was evidence, right? And you give that evidence and we will absolutely listen to what the evidence is saying, even though we have not had a census since. Evidence-based policy making can happen without a census, without an economic survey, without a periodic labor force upgrade. Data nahi hai, magar evidence-based ye hai. This is also a political construction around data, right? So a pulse was us for a way to, so you see a lot of what the book is for us, taking these things that we sort of intuitively know and trying to put them down in certain kinds of ways. And I think that, and so the question for us then was, can you create a pulse? And I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And I think a political party can create a pulse differently from a movement, differently from an artist. But as people who have a relationship with knowledge, my personal takeaway from that section of the book was to realize that one work we must do no matter what happens is at some part of your knowledge must play the long game. It must seed ideas, not because they are the ideas that are contemporary in the pulse. You must seed the ideas because at some point their moment will come. And we thought of this as this idea of conditions of possibility, right? That part of our role for knowledge is to create language that may not have its moment right now. It may not even be received right now, but that's part of our work in producing knowledge. It is to produce knowledge that will create the conditions for its own practice. And this is the linking of thinking and doing we don't talk about enough. There is certain thinking that sets up doing, but the doing happens a long way away. It is not so immediate कि मैंने ये report लिखी और कल ये हो गया, which is what a lot of our students want. Honestly, there's a lot of feeling our students saying, I want to see the impact of this. But there's another way that work gets created. You seed it and it takes that time. And for us, I mean, for me personally, the example of that was the 377 case, right? I filed that case when I was part of the filing of that case when I was 24. And when it finished, I was not 24, right? But I'm also saying that in that period of time, what changed was the language in which people talked about queer people in this country. And that language did not change in 24. Our job when we were 24 was just to hold the language. Bas, humko kya pata tha wo, like how, actually we did not know how cool it would become. I was just saying, and also how oddly depolitical in a way that also good and bad things, no? But there was a way in which our job at that point was to say, create the conditions of possibility. You don't know at that point what's going to happen, but you lay the seeds.
No, yeah, I think it's a little bit like a chain, you keep building a chain. And I think our work on rentals is also very much similar, where, we were seeing rentals at a time when the housing policy space had absolutely zero space for it. And then now we see we are in some sort of intermediate moment. And then we dream that one day rent will be a real, like a, cornerstone of housing policy. So absolutely, there's nothing immediate about the work that we do. So we're all opportunists building our case and waiting for the pulse to come.
Waiting to be in the pulse once in a while.
Right.
The hope is that at least once in your life you get to be in the pulse.
Yes.
And not waiting for it.
So I'll have one last question, which is a little maybe a little bit away from the content. I was actually thinking, you've written a book in a world where not many people read. Thank you for writing a very short book. That's great. But for a lot of our...
It's short and
yes,
cheap.
Yes. And I know you must have done a lot of work to
Right.
make sure that it was cheap. And thank you for that too. But for younger professionals entering the world of practice, have you thought of gamifying the book in some way so that, it's more interactive?
This is me gamifying the book.
This is you gamifying the book. Okay.
The last 40 minutes have been me gamifying the book, selling it, making it sound cuter than it is, making it storytelling, making
No, it's
metaphors
cuter
about
than you
naras
made it
and knots.
sound.
It's cuter than I made it sound.
Which is why I'm asking this question.
The reason that we say yes to all invitations is to gamify it and say, even if you don't, we will entice you with a certain set of stories. No, but honestly, I feel this very strongly, in the sense that I feel like in my own writing, in the books that I've been part of, they have becoming less and less and less proper and more readable. Mm-hmm. And I am very happy about this. I think this book, it is an academic text, but it is, for an academic text, very readable. And I hope that when you sit with it, we were very conscious of that. We wanted to, also because we felt like the complexity of the moment was enough on its own. The language did not need to be complicated. The complexity stands. And so this is something one of my teachers told me a very long time ago. She said it is very different. She said complexity is not complicated and simple is not simplistic. And if you don't lose sight of that, and the people who are best at this are scientists and philosophers. So if academic writing that I adore is, people who write about black holes and then like a 20-page Chantal Mouffe book on democracy, the philosophers, the language is light and clear and jargon free, and it still hurts your head because the concept is only so complex, right? So I think that there is something to be said about it in many ways. And ironically, what's really nice about it is that writing this has also made me deeply appreciate the complex theoretical texts I wrote. And so what writing this book has done for me is it's allowed me not in my head to have high ground either about clear writing, because I also want moments where I sit in complexity and it is complex and I have to do the work and it's fine. So I think the idea is to have multiple ways for it, right? And I don't, a lot of people praise simple writing, almost sort of shading writing that is more complex, that makes the reader do more work. But I think as readers, once in a while, we should do more work. And I think it gives us a lot to do that work. So I am, in a way that it's odd. In a way, every time I was writing this, I was thinking that it was because of that work that I can write like this. You can't just write simply. It's working through the hard stuff that gets you to write like this. But I enjoy the simplicity of it very much. I'm very happy to have a book in this tone.
Great. With that, maybe it's time to open up to the audience. We'll take a few, maybe couple of 3 questions. It's good? Yeah.
Thank you for the discussion. My name is Ansh, and I just have 2 questions, right? One is going to the description bit. The not is often not.
Hold it a bit away.
Is this?
No, the other way. Just take it away a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. I don't know how this works. Great. Just going back to the redescriptions bit, the not is often not just a knot, it's more entangled, right? And that's some of the questions that those of us working on the city are sort of encountering, wherein we're trying to do work that's highly interdisciplinary, which is also making us do more work. But also we're constantly confronting issues which are more fleeting, more ephemeral, and way more entangled. A key concern with this kind of work also ends up being institutional funding, right? Institutions, donors, funders, just not understanding this kind of work. So any sort of thoughts on that would be great. The second bit, since both of you are in some ways pedagogues and practitioners, and since Dr. Naik got this question that how do you communicate with younger scholars, how do you sort of teach this relationship, this tense relationship between theory and practice to students? Any sort of thoughts, advice for folks who are trying to communicate also with activists and trying to make people understand that maybe this is in some ways meaningful would be great. Yeah.
This is Sensei Raj from the Global Changemakers Network and Vision Year 2032, which is a capacity development movement. Very right on what you've been speaking on. It is absolutely refreshing and really innovative to hear somebody putting this in the form of a book, and it is already practiced, and 4 of them coming together from across the world. So congratulations, and I think from everybody to you. There are so many damn questions, but I will nail it down to three. First off, I got the essence of the book, if I could possibly put it that. The flux and moving away from the defined, so-called the order from the south, from the north rather. And I think it's a movement from the south to break the what do you call the towers of the orders from which it emanates from Davos and such. Sorry to take the name. But the question comes down to, it's more of a rhetorical question, pondering rather. How do infrastructures reflect and reproduce social hierarchies? Given the infrastructures is not really neutral, it reveals power, infusion, exclusion, and so on and so forth, right? We all understand that. That's number one. Number two, can we really embrace informality not as lack, but as a form of governance and innovation? You mentioned the blue cover when we fly over Bombay. It is not uniquely isolation to Bombay. It's all over the world, even in the so-called mature economies of the so-called first countries. Sorry, I didn't realize. Because even there, the dark aspects do live and thrive. The subterranean economies, subterranean cities. So on that, if you could weave the thread, because weave has been the word beautifully put for this book description and on the deeper engagement and the dialogues coming out. Sure. So that was two. If I can get away with the third one.
It would be good if we can pass the mic to one more person. We don't have a lot
Thank
of
you.
time.
I'll do that.
You can, of
Thank
course,
you.
ask Gautam after the talk. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for the lovely talk. So I'm Ankush, and I'm currently working on the dissertation where I'm looking at urban informality, which draws from your book and also Ananda Roy's work. But how would you suggest engaging with, let's say, the common way of looking at cities in most disciplines is to study ghettos instead of urban elite neighborhoods, right?
Sure.
But when you go to question elite neighborhoods, you run into a lot of problems where accessing data becomes a problem. People are reluctant to be interviewed. You don't have access to the land deeds. And your hypothesis tells you that what is happening is clearly quote unquote informal, but you don't have the solid data to prove it. So how would you suggest one, engages?
Sure. Okay, really lovely questions. I'll go quickly. So to yours, so I think that the question of the knots, right? And it is very true that current systems, they're knots for a reason. And they're knots because they don't fit into the current ways of research and investigation. So you have to anticipate that resistance. It's not, that invitation is not going to be there, right? But it's shifting quite quickly. Even if I look at what's happened in the last 10 years, the openness, now we have this opposite problem. You said funding institutional landscapes, but people insist on interdisciplinarity. It is the opposite thing, right? But what they mean by it, they're not sure. I think of it in this way. I think of it as, regardless of large, big institutional or structure moves, each of us has, from where we are, ways to move to have degrees of interdisciplinarity and layering in our work, right? Say you work on X, add one layer to it. Say you work on domestic workers, right? And you work on domestic workers, you think about their wages and you think about the quality of their employment, you describe them as informal workers. I want you to think about where they live instead of what work they do. I want you to think about the fact that domestic workers pay a third more rent compared to other informal workers, more than construction, more than waste workers. Why? Because domestic workers' work has a certain spatiality. They have to walk to elite homes, right? 5 elite homes a day, because our model of urban domestic work is now live out. So that means they can't live in low-income peripheral urban informal settlements or urban villages. They have to live behind Jorbagh. The domestic workers of Jorbagh do not come from East Delhi. They come from Jorbagh, right? So that means that they pay disproportionate rent, which means when you're in a domestic workers union meeting, half your discussion is not about collective bargaining of wages, it's about rent. This is a layering. This is a moving. So I would say don't wait for the big institutional invitation for the large. Aayega to great. But from where your work is, layer it, degree it, add one piece to it. It's exactly what we do pedagogically. right? Because you can't also suddenly pedagogically tell a student from now you will do spatial, economic, social, political, altogether, ecological now. That's a falsehood. There are degrees and there are layers. So we keep saying from where you are, add one more. Okay? You're looking at social protection. Think about what heat does to social protection for construction workers. And now you know that when we have a heat wave, we are able to use the disaster management law to stop construction work and pay wages. This is a coming together. It does not mean that you now have solved every intersectional of the construction workers' life. Layering. I think that's the thing about interdisciplinarity. People want to do sort of all of it at once. Right? That's like a mixie mein jaake pura stew. It's not a chana masala. One masala at a time. You add it like in layering. That's the way, pedagogically, that's what we tell our students. One layer at a time. Don't jump to all of them. Right? I think I'll answer the informality question together. The question of informality for us has shifted in this moment. We spent a lot of years, informal scholars, basically saying informality is not invisible, it is not negative, it is not criminal. That moment has passed. There is a kind of, because the earlier theories, economists told us informality happens in modernization, third world se second world se first world jaoge, informality will vanish, right? We had 10 years of good growth, it went nowhere. Right? India remains 80% informal by labor. It has not changed. So now even the ILO admits informality is not going to vanish. It is not a transition. So now we're in a moment saying, if it's not a transition, what is it? If it's not a problem, what could it be? The challenge for us as practitioners is to resist both sides of the problem. You cannot romanticize tarpaulin, right? But you cannot punish someone for living in tarpaulin. So the challenge of informality is to recognize the vulnerability, but not erase the agency. Right? And this is a very hard struggle for us. When we work in informal settlements, we are sometimes standing there watching that G+4 self-built house in an urban village in Delhi. At one point you want to say agency hai, investment hai, life hai, but we are also looking at it and saying, us fourth floor mein column nahi hai, wo brick mein mortar nahi hai, wo girega. Right? I can't deny that. So the challenge of informality is, it is the existing practice that has produced our cities at scale. Denying that is a lie and it is naive. Right? Architects and planners have not built our cities. Let's be very clear. No matter how seriously we take ourselves as professionals, the built form of our cities has been built by people. Now, whether that should have happened or not happened is besides the point. But people have suffered an enormous cost to build that housing. Right? So this tension between recognizing vulnerability but not flattening agency, this is the question of informality. So the way we approach it in practice is to say, don't try and erase what is there. See it as the beginning and lift it, right? So a street vending act comes, it recognizes street vendors' labor first. Then it talks about vending spaces. Then it talks about the right to vend, right? So I feel like we have gig workers are a very good example now, right? So you now, I think, are in a place where most governance in India is not looking to punish informality. Now we're at a point where we don't know how to support it the best we can, while also not abandoning it. Because the other thing for public policy, it's very easy to say, अब लोगों ने अपना घर बना दिया तो मुझे घर बनाने की जरूरत नहीं, right? So बस्ती ने आपको शहर में लेबर ले आया, आपने स्टेडियम बना दिया गेम्स के लिए, अब 20 साल बाद आप बुलडोजर भी ला सकते हो, right? So we have also used informality as a way to abandon people and their rights. We have left them in housing. The question we should be asking is, why should anyone live in tarpaulin in our cities? Because if you pay 30% of your income as rent, and if most urban Indians make less than 10,000 rupees, you tell me, where are you supposed to live for 1,500 rupees a month? You find me legal, affordable, adequate housing in Delhi for 1,500 rupees a month, and then you can do whatever you want to the slum and call it encroachment. Until you cannot live in 1,500 rupees a month, you don't have a right to criminalize informal survival. You pushed people to that survival. So our recognition has to be, it is amazing to me that in all the talk about encroachment of public land, the only person not held accountable is the state. Always the state. We were in a court case once where the judge said, would you let someone live on your roof for, and I said, if someone has been living on my roof for 20 years, then मैंने भी कुछ समझौता किया होगा ना. वो 20 साल से वो बस्ती आपके सामने है, रात में छुप के नहीं बसी है, आपने बसाई है. Yamuna Pushta was said because contractors bought workers to build the Asian Games stadiums in trucks. Right? You created that economy. The cities ran on their economy. And now you're turning around and saying informality is inadequate. That's manipulation. It is a game to say enough rights to get labor, but never enough rights to be citizens. So informality has to be where we begin, because the danger is this. If tomorrow I say all people should live only in Pakka housing, then what you're doing is you are essentially using minimum standards as a way to punish the poor. Because they cannot move from tarpaulin to concrete. Itna jump koi nahi karta, not when wages are flat. So our development will have to be incremental. If it has to be incremental, it has to begin from where we are. That house will improve slowly. It cannot improve overnight. If it improves overnight, it will improve the housing, but the people will be gone. This is what the slum public-private redevelopment SRA story is in Bombay. Bombay built hundreds of thousands of vertical things. What happened in the end? Did the slum percentage of Bombay go down? Not 1%. Because you cannot shift a house when a life has not shifted. Wage nahi hil raha, housing market nahi hil sakta. So there has to be a way in which we take. My point about informality is very simple. When you start with practice, ask where do people work, where do people live? You improve that. If you're not willing to be honest about where people work and people live, you are making a policy for New York and applying it in New Delhi. Wo best practice say, it looks very good, it works very well, but don't then pretend that the problem is going to be solved. It's not, it's a performance, and it is foolish. And the foolishness of it is that you want to pretend we are not who we are. But then we will not change. So informality conceptually and in practice, but I will be honest also, it is not easy to work with it. And it is very easy to say protect people's homes and then leave them in homes which have no insulation, no shelter, no drainage and no toilets. And that's also not okay. So this tension, informality is not a state, it is a tension. How much recognition, how much visibility, how much protection, how much abandonment. Ab street vendor ko vending zone de doge, that is the right amount of recognition. Vending zone mein vending license daloge, license ka fee charge karoge, usko plot daloge, that is too much regulation. Fir wo market mar jayega. So think of the Daryaganj Sunday book market. Enough recognition that you don't displace it. Too much recognition and the market pricing will die. Informality is this tension. What is the right degree of recognition, the right degree of regulation? You have to rethink what public policy is. But we can't imagine public policy that has this much flexibility. Right? So either we want to formalize the market or we want to evict the market. We have binaries and we have to get out of that thing. Last line on your question on elite. It is absolutely the biggest question of our time, because it is the same question not of, and it is a methodological problem, it is a knowledge problem, but it is fundamentally a power problem. The definition of social power is that those who hold it do not answer questions. That is the way power reproduces. So we did a study of domestic unpaid and paid care work within the home. 10,000 household survey, Bangalore and Chennai. And we were like, we have studied domestic workers for 20 years. We want to study employers. Instead of asking workers and saying, how much money do you want to make? We want to ask employers, how much money do you pay? Right? 62% rejection rate in interviews. Doors slammed in our faces. Families. Imagine coming into someone's house in a gated community in South Bangalore saying, "Aap domestic worker ko kitna salary dete ho? Chutti dete ho? Health insurance dete ho? Labor rights dete ho?" Imagine these questions. We got there in the end. What's even more frightening is that there were enough people willing to answer the questions because they actually thought they were generous, good employers. And that frightened me even more than the lack of access to elite households. And then we asked them, do you think the wages you pay are adequate, fair, generous? Not even fair, generous. They think that 6,000 rupees a month is generous because that is the notion they have of the skill of domestic work. They see it as an extension of a woman's work. I mean, this we know, right? Feminist scholarship in India has taught us why domestic workers are paid what domestic workers are paid, right? So to me, the question of studying the elite, the question of studying power, absolutely central. Central to really taking on questions of inequality. We are, it's not just the Piketty kind of whatever, like snapshot ad movement. There is fundamentally, we are unequal in a way that we have never been in our democratic history. And inequality has to be the central question of our time. But if you study inequality, you must anticipate that it will refuse interrogation. It will refuse that. So it's not that the data is not there, it will never be there. So therefore, how as scholars do we triangulate? What do we use as a proxy? How do we find other forms of evidence? Because power will always refuse to explain itself. So how do we change our methods in those ways? I think that's the real challenge. But we've got to start inequality. And I will say one last thing about this. Studying inequality, elite, does not mean only studying the top 1%. It means studying the entire top 25%. This focus on the 1% also makes it very easy to study this hyper-elite oligarchy, which is very important. But inequality structures are not just about the hyper-elite 1%. There are multiple other structural forms that reproduce, and particularly in India, social inequality in a caste polity reproduces not just through the 1%, it reproduces structurally through the gradedness of the caste system. So we have to also not borrow this 1% interrogation that a lot of political economy and new inequality studies from North America are giving us. Our inequality is graded all the way down. If there's one thing Ambedkar taught us, it's not about just one layer, it is gradation. So graded inequality cannot be studied in the same way as a bipolar 1% and 99% in that language. We have to find ways to study inequality that understand our structures. They are much more intermeshed than that division.
So to bring it back to the book, I think this whole question of being creative with methodology is sort of a subtext in the book, which is not like you're not articulated in that way, but it's really there in all the layers, because all the examples provide all those different entry points that people made, the four authors made into very difficult questions in different locations. So that's also...
For us, interdisciplinarity actually, in the end of the day, is a debate about methods, and not about topics. The topics are much easier. No, everyone is happy to move across a disciplinary aisle. It is when the economists start taking ethnography seriously and the anthropologists start taking geospatiality seriously that we will have actually some interdisciplinarity. It's the methods that are the hardest part. Yeah. We're too married to them, and the methods belong to disciplines. So every time we ask our students, why do you do qualitative research? Because I'm a sociologist. That's not an answer. Methods belong to questions, they don't belong to disciplines. And this is part of that hyper-specialization, right? And I get the reasons for it. But it leaves us in a very precarious position where we stick to methodological traditions because of our disciplinary origins, as opposed to what our questions require us to look at.
So collaborate.
That is the only way to do it. Because you can't become a geospatial expert. But you know what you can do? Work with one. And then the pedagogical question to me is fascinating, which is how much do you need to know to be a smart collaborator as opposed to being an expert? And this is what I wish pedagogy would do. And if you want an example, I teach a lot at the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy, where the IS officers go for regular trainings, right? And they're a really interesting set of students to have, because they always want to know just enough, but not too much. So as a teacher, I know you're here, sir. I see you. I know you know. I have had many folks like sir in the corner in my classroom. There are two things that happen in Mussoorie. One is you have 3 minutes. In the first 3 minutes, either you're in or you're out. It's like harder than fashion. It's like being Project Runway on crack, because they are senior officers, so they decide in the first 3 minutes whether they're listening. And the second thing is they want this. They want to be good readers of 100 scenarios. They don't want to be singing. And I have learned so much from those classrooms about the right degree of... So Bijoy is here. Bijoy and I have written a paper together on mapping Delhi's COVID relief work, which has a very strong spatial analysis of how close were people who asked for food, how close were they to a ration shop, right? Now, I know how that method works, but I can't do that method. But we are able to collaborate because he can implement it, but we both ask the same question. So I think there's a really lovely pedagogical question here, which is, what does it mean to be a good listener and a good question asker and a good collaborator without necessarily needing to be a full expert? Because if you hold the bar to that, then we will never collaborate. And people fear collaboration because they feel like I don't know enough. And at that moment, you should only collaborate more. Because in the collaboration, you learn what you need to know. And that's where the real maza is in some ways.
process.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we warmly welcome Director, India Habitat Center, Professor Dr. K.G. Suresh, who is here with us. Thank you so much, sir, for taking time out of your busy schedule. I request sir to please come to the dais and present a memento to Dr. Gautam Bhan and Dr. Mukta Naik.
Really thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Sorry, I missed the major part, but I will make it up by reading to you. I will try to be an expert.
Not, you know what I have? One thing I have, I want to give one to the Habitat Center. So this one. This one is for you.
Thank you so
It's a
much.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhan, Dr. Naik, for a very thought-provoking, very lively discussion. And thank you to the wonderful audience for your meaningful questions. Thank you, sir, for your presence here. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Welcome.